From Black Noir being Homelander's unhinged clone in the comics, to Ryan getting a chance to live in the series as a Soup's son. Here are the biggest changes from the boys' comic books to the series. For starters, one of the mysterious characters in the show, Black Noir, has quite a dark backstory in the comics. You see, this guy was Vought's silent assassin, carrying out orders like a loyal dog and never stepping out of line. Then in Season 3, the show finally unveils his true identity under the mask. And it turns out that he's a dude we've never seen before in the show. Now, the reason why this is so shocking is because in the comic books, Noir is supposed to be Homelander's deranged clone. Yep, you heard that right. Apparently, this twisted clone was created to keep Homelander in check. Also, toward the end of the boys' comic run, Homelander tries to take over the world by leading a coup. But when it's finally time to have a showdown with his arch-nemesis, Billy Butcher, it's Black Noir who ends up taking down the psychotic Soup, not Butcher. This is obviously way different from what the show had in mind for Noir's character. He may not be Homelander's clone, but he does have a fleshed-out and tragic backstory, including some serious abuse at the hands of Soldier Boy. But while the show tried to make Black Noir seem kinda sad in our eyes, they made Homelander even more evil than his comic counterpart. You see, in the books, one of the biggest twists is that Homelander was gaslit into becoming a monster by his clone. Because as it turns out, Noir pulled off half of the evil deeds that Homelander mistakenly thinks he did. It's a twist that keeps you on the edge of your seat, but it also lets Homelander off the hook by giving him an excuse for his actions and his massive ego. Guess what though? The series tosses that Black Noir twist out the window by taking away his scapegoat and make him willingly choose to become the evil monster we all love to hate. In the show, Homelander is still as entitled and spoiled as ever, driven by a desperate need for love. Not gonna lie, all of this makes him even scarier because he's fully aware of his choices. Hell of a character arc indeed. What's interesting to see though is that the TV series also changed some characters' backstories and storylines. Take Mother's Milk for example. In the series, they make a big fuss about him being the only natural-born Soup. But guess what? The comics tell a completely different story. You see, Mother's Milk was actually born with powers because his mother was sadly exposed to Compound V in a contaminated factory. Now, he's not your typical flashy superhero with a gigantic list of powers, but he does have super strength. The ultimate twist, though, is that he needs to regularly feed from his mother's breast to survive. And that's why they call him Mother's Milk. Yikes. This detail didn't make it to the show, thank God. But hey, it would have been one wild addition, wouldn't it? His family life also ended up being a tad different. In the comics, his wife doesn't play a big role, and their relationship isn't exactly sunshine and rainbows. As for his daughter, she's already going through her teenage rebel phase. In the series, Mother's Milk seems to have a healthier relationship with his wife, and his daughter is much younger than the comic book version. While these differences may not seem that big, there are some other plot lines in the show that have a major impact on the storyline, like the role of Temp Fee in everybody's lives. Unlike your typical superhero origins where they're born with powers, in the world of the boys, Soups aren't born, they're made. The series also shows Vought as a big bad corporate giant that came up with Compound V to turn regular humans into superpowered beings. After all, it's their ticket to incredible influence and control. But here's where things get interesting. In the comics, the boys take a less refined version of Compound V to level the playing field against the Soups, and even get their own dose of superpowers. Talk about a power-up. Another thing that's different in the show is that they take their sweet time building up to Butcher and Huey getting hooked on this stuff. But in the comics, Huey gets injected with it on his very first mission. That's one way to dive headfirst into the superhero gig. And let's not forget about the side effects of Temp V. The show's version will give you brain degradation and eventual death after 3 to 5 doses, which raises the stakes to 100 compared to the comics. Speaking of making things worse, let's not forget the villains of this franchise. One of the most famous ones, Stormfront, ends up being an actual killer doll in the show and is played brilliantly by Aya Cash. But in the comics, the character is supposed to be a dude. This gender swap was a refreshing change, no doubt, bringing more female representation into the mix. After all, it's not like it hurts the character at all, since the origins and powers of Stormfront are similar in both versions. But the storyline's a bit different. You see, the character's the original leader of Payback, a rival group to the Seven in the comics. But in the show's 3rd season, Stormfront is nowhere to be found when we finally learn about the group. Instead, they're led by the charismatic Soldier Boy. Apart from that, Stormfront's romantic interests are worlds apart. The male version goes after Queen Maeve, but the show spices things up with a different dynamic between Stormfront and Homelander. Also, the shady allegiances of Stormfront that the comics created were a perfect starting point for the showrunners to add in a new villain. But they ended up becoming super creative with her character and adapted her to better suit Homelander's arc. Safe to say, she's not the only one who was given more freedom with her character, because we also got Victoria Newman, who tried to take control of her own story. She's also part of those few gender-swapped roles, because Victoria actually appears in the comics as Victor Newman. He's a high-ranking political figure known as Vic the Veep, and acts as an inside man for Vought. Sound familiar? Well, the show kept the political aspect intact, but they made some changes to make things more interesting. Our girl Victoria isn't just another Vought lapdog. She has a vision of her own. Plus, she also has a terrifying ability to pop people's heads off whenever she wants. It's a power that adds a whole new level of intensity to her character, unlike the non-powered Victor from the comics. You best believe popping the heads of innocent civilians isn't the most evil thing happening in the series. There's also the tragic Flight 37 crash that ends up killing a lot of people. When it comes to the timeline of the incident, though, the on-screen and the comic book version clash a bit. In the comics, it was actually tied to the events of September 11. The Supes detained one of the attacking planes. But instead of saving the people in it, they redirected the plane to the Brooklyn Bridge, causing even more chaos and loss. This version of the story was supposed to show us how reckless the Seven were, and painted them as supposed heroes who didn't care for innocent lives. Turns out that the incident in the show is even worse, because Homelander and a reluctant Queen Maeve straight up abandoned all the passengers as the plane crashed into the ocean. It's definitely a sad ending in both versions. In other aspects of the story, the show brought us one of the biggest plot twists ever, by revealing that Rebecca's son is not only alive, but he's living a secret life with her. We know that Ryan's the result of a tragic and violent event, when Homelander actually violated Butcher's wife. On screen, both the Supe and Butcher end up believing that Rebecca and the child didn't survive because of a horrifying childbirth. But turns out they were alive and well, living in a Vought compound. Then we get the shock of our lives when we find out that the average-looking kid was actually born with powers of his own, and they're very similar to his dad's. As impressive as those powers are, the son is taught to suppress them because Rebecca tells him they're bad. This entire storyline is way different than the comic's dark twist, because there, Ryan ends up dying at birth, thanks to Butcher's explosive rage. But hey, the showrunners had their reasons for making this change. By keeping the son alive, they added a whole new layer to the feud between Butcher and Homelander, and there's a sense of responsibility weighing on Butcher's shoulders, because the situation becomes personal to him. So there you have it, from Ryan getting a chance to live in the series as a Supe's son, to Black Noir being Homelander's unhinged clone in the comics. Here are the biggest changes from the boys' comic books to the series.